There is a clay tablet in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford that does not begin where history is supposed to begin. It begins before the flood. Not metaphorically, before the flood, in a period the document treats as continuous with everything that follows, with the same administrative formulas, the same record-keeping logic, the same assumption that what is being preserved is worth preserving. The tablet is a list of kings. The first king reigned for 28,800 years. The second reigned for 36,000. The list gives these numbers without apology, without elaboration, and without any indication that the scribes who copied them found them unusual. It does not explain the numbers. It does not contextualize them within any larger cosmological framework visible to the reader. It simply records them in the same neutral administrative register used to record grain allocations and temple inventories, as if impossibility were a category the document had no use for. I found the Sumerian King List the way you find most things that matter, while looking for something else. I was tracing the scribal conventions used to record dynastic transitions in early Mesopotamian administrative texts, trying to understand why certain formula phrases appear unchanged across 1,000 years of political upheaval, and the King List kept surfacing as the earliest and clearest example of the pattern. The deeper I went, the more I realized the formulas weren't the real problem. The numbers were, and the numbers led somewhere that the standard account of ancient history cannot comfortably accommodate. The Sumerian King List survives in over a dozen cuneiform fragments and copies, the most complete of which is the Weld-Blundell Prism, a four-sided clay column excavated at Larsa and now held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The prism dates to approximately 1800 BCE, but the tradition it records is older, substantially older. Thorkild Jacobsen, whose 1939 critical edition remains the foundational scholarly treatment of the text, identified linguistic and structural features suggesting the list draws on sources predating the Earthly period, with oral or administrative roots that may extend further still. The scribes who inscribed the Weld-Blundell Prism were not composing, they were copying, and what they copied begins not with the first king of a known dynasty, but with a cosmological statement that has never been satisfactorily explained, that before any human institution existed, kingship itself arrived from somewhere above. That phrase is not decorative. In Mesopotamian administrative culture, the legitimacy of a ruler derived from divine appointment. A king ruled because the gods had granted the right, and that right could be transferred, withdrawn, or relocated from one city to another. The King List formalizes this theology into a historical record. But the opening formula is load-bearing. The document is telling you that what follows is not merely the history of rulers. It is the history of a cosmic institution temporarily housed in human cities. And the first city that institution chose was Eridu. Eridu is the oldest city in the Sumerian tradition. Archaeological work at Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, conducted most extensively in the 1940s under Fuad Sippar, and again supplemented in later decades, revealed occupation layers reaching back to approximately 5,400 BCE, among the earliest urban settlements yet identified in Mesopotamia. In Sumerian cosmological thought, Eridu was not simply the first city to be built, it was the first city to exist, the place where the god Enki established the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean, understood as the source of wisdom, magic, and the me, the divine laws governing civilization itself, craftsmanship, priesthood, the scribal arts, all of these were Enki's domain, and Eridu was where he kept them. The King List assigns Eridu two kings. Alulim reigned for 28,800 years. Alalgar reigned for 36,000. Together they account for 64,800 years of pre-flood history at a single site. The standard scholarly response is that these figures are mythological or astronomical in origin, multiples of the Sumerian sexagesimal base, the base 60 system underlying the 360-degree circle and the 60-minute hour. That explanation is reasonable. It is also incomplete. Random mythological inflation produces approximate round numbers. These figures are not approximate. They are precise multiples of a specific mathematical unit, structured with the same internal consistency you would expect from a calendrical or astronomical calculation. What the reign lengths record is unclear. That they were deliberately constructed is not. After Eridu, kingship moves. This is the structural feature of the pre-flood section that receives the least attention and deserves the most. Kingship does not expand outward from Eridu to encompass multiple cities simultaneously. It transfers, cleanly, completely, to a new location. The second city is Bad-tibira. 3 kings, reign lengths of 36,000, 43,200, and 28,800 years. The longest reign in the entire pre-flood record belongs here, Enmengalana, at 43,200 years. Exactly 8 multiples of 5,400, a figure with known significance in Sumerian astronomical reckoning. Bad-tibira means, roughly, the fortified place of the copper workers. It was the city of Dumuzi, the shepherd god associated with fertility, the dying season, and the ritual lament that echoes through Mesopotamian literature for 2,000 years. The movement of kingship from the city of wisdom and subterranean water to the city of metal and craft is not arbitrary. Each pre-flood city occupied a specific position in the Sumerian understanding of what civilization required. The sequence in which kingship moved through them traces something that looks less like a political history and more like a structured index, each city holding a different domain of the knowledge that made the world function. The third city is Larak, 1 king in Sippar, reigning for 28,800 years. Larak is the least documented of the 5 pre-flood cities. Its location has not been definitively confirmed. No major excavation has identified its site. It appears in a small number of other Sumerian texts, but leaves almost no independent trace in the surviving record. This near absence is not evidence against its existence. It is a data point about what was lost between the pre-flood world and the world that copied its memory onto clay. The King List records Larak without apology and moves on. Sippar is different. Sippar, modern Tel Abu Haba, extensively excavated in the 19th century, was one of the most important religious centers in ancient Mesopotamia. City of Shamash, the sun god, divine judge whose domain included law, truth, and the written word. The association matters. Sippar was understood as the place where divine writing was kept, where the laws of the cosmos had been inscribed before the flood and where they would need to be recovered after it. In the flood narrative tradition, it is at Sippar that the antediluvian wisdom texts are said to have been buried before the waters came, so they could be dug up and restored once the world resumed. The King List gives Sippar 1 king, Enmengalana, reigning for 21,000 years. He is the shortest reigning of all pre-flood kings and possibly the most symbolically significant. Other texts identify him as the figure to whom the gods taught the reading of omens, the interpretation of oil on water, the first keeper of divination. His city is the archive of the pre-flood world, and it is the last stop before everything ends. The 5th city is Shuruppak. Kingship arrives there last before the flood, carried by 1 king, Ubaratutu, who reigned for 18,600 years, the shortest reign in the pre-flood sequence, as if time itself were compressing toward a threshold. The name Shuruppak appears across Mesopotamian literature in a way that no other pre-flood city does. It is not simply a place on a list. It is a place with a story that survived the water, and the story is older than any of the tablets that preserved it. Shuruppak means, in the most widely accepted interpretation, the healing place, or the place of refuge. The etymology is not decorative. In the Sumerian flood narrative known from the Eridu Genesis, preserved on a fragmentary tablet in the University Museum in Philadelphia, first translated by Thorkild Jacobsen and Samuel Noah Kramer, it is at Shuruppak that Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero, receives his warning. The gods have decided to send the flood. One god, speaking through a wall or a reed hut in the oldest version of a story that will be retold for 3,000 years, tells Ziusudra what is coming and instructs him to build a vessel. The city of refuge becomes the last city before the end of everything, and the King List confirms it. Shuruppak is where kingship rested when the flood arrived. Then the line comes. The flood swept over. That is nearly the complete text of the rupture. No description of the water, no duration, no account of what was destroyed or who survived beyond the single figure already embedded in the flood narrative tradition. The administrative record notes the event and resumes. What follows is a new section header. After the flood had swept over, kingship again descended from heaven. And then a new city, Kish, and a new sequence of kings. The document treats the destruction of the entire pre-flood world as a transitional notation between 2 administrative periods. This is either the most extreme compression in ancient literature or the behaviour of a document whose audience already knew exactly what those 3 words meant and required no elaboration. The grammar matters here. Mesopotamian scribes used specific conventional phrases to mark different kinds of transitions. The transfer of kingship from city to city, the defeat of one dynasty by another, divine intervention in human affairs. Each transition type has its formula. The flood gets one too, swept over, the verb active and complete, a bounded event with a beginning and an end. Not a mythological chaos without edges, a historical occurrence in the administrative record, treated with the same linguistic register as a military defeat or a dynastic handoff. The scribes who copied this line were not writing poetry. They were filing a notation. Consider what the King List does not say. It doesn't declare the pre-flood cities destroyed. It records that kingship moved among them during the pre-flood period, that the flood swept over, and that kingship descended from heaven again at a new location. The cities themselves, Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, are not declared gone. They are simply no longer the seat of the cosmic institution. And several continued to function as settlements in the historical period. Eridu is attested through the 3rd millennium. Sippar was a major city for 2,000 years after the flood date the text implies. Shuruppak, modern Telfara, excavated by a German team in 1902 and an American team in the 1930s, shows occupation layers from the early 4th millennium through the early 2nd millennium BCE, with a pronounced early dynastic stratum sitting directly above a layer of water-laid sediment approximately 1 metre thick, dated to approximately 2900 BCE. That sediment layer is not unique to Shuruppak. Leonard Woolley found a comparable deposit at Ur. Similar layers have been identified at Kish and at Uruk. The debate about whether any of these corresponds to the literary flood is unresolved and likely unresolvable with current methods. What is not debated is that the sediment is there, at the site the tradition identifies as the last city before the end, beneath the administrative records of a civilization that came after. Here is where the 7-city question becomes impossible to set aside. The core Sumerian King List tradition gives 5 cities before the flood, but the tradition is not uniform. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 278 BCE, produced a history of Babylon, the Babyloniarcha, drawing on temple archives that no longer exist. His version names 10 antediluvian kings, not 8, and lists their cities differently, with some names corresponding to the Sumerian tradition and some that do not. The total number of cities in his account is disputed because the text survives only in fragments quoted by later authors. But the structure is identical. Multiple cities, impossible reign lengths, a flood, a survivor, a resumption. The tradition is wider than any single tablet, and if Berossus was drawing on sources independent of the Weld-Blundell scribal lineage, which the differences in his king names strongly suggest, then the 5-city count of the cuneiform tradition may represent a partial preservation of something larger, not a fabrication of 7 cities, a damaged record of a more complete sacred geography that the surviving tablets no longer fully contain. The number 5 is what the tablets give us. The number 7, and the expanded traditions that gesture toward it, mark the edge of what the tablets preserved, and ask what was lost at that boundary. A title that promises 7 cities is not inventing a tradition. It is pointing at the place where the tradition frays and asking what was on the other side of the damage. The parallel that makes this impossible to dismiss as coincidence is structural, not numerical. The Genesis genealogies list 10 antediluvian patriarchs, Adam through Noah, with lifespans beginning at 930 years and collapsing gradually toward the human range across the generations that follow the flood. The Sumerian King List shows the same decompression pattern across a different numerical range. 2 independent literary traditions in 2 different languages, using 2 different mathematical systems, encoding the same structural movement. A world before the flood where time ran by different rules, and a world after it where time gradually normalized toward the scale of a human life. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, and too structurally embedded to be simple borrowing. Both traditions are preserving the same underlying shape. Neither of them invented it. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again. The formula is identical to the one that opened the pre-flood section. Not similar, not adapted, not updated for a new era. Identical. The scribes who composed this document treated the pre-flood and post-flood periods as continuous history separated by an event, the way a chronicle might treat a dynasty interrupted by conquest and then restored. The flood is not the boundary between myth and history in this document. It is a transition point within a single, unbroken administrative tradition, and the tradition resumes on the other side of it, without changing its language or its assumptions. The first post-flood city is Kish. The King List assigns Kish 23 kings in its first dynasty, opening with Jusha, who reigned 1,200 years. The number is still impossible by any biological standard, but it is not 43,200. The compression has already begun, and it began the moment the floodline was crossed. By the third king of Kish, the reigns are in the hundreds of years. By the 10th, they are approaching a range that would seem merely legendary rather than cosmological. The decompression is not perfectly uniform. There are anomalies throughout, but the directional movement is consistent and it tracks across the entire post-flood sequence toward an eventual convergence with human scale. Gilgamesh appears roughly a third of the way through the post-flood section, the 5th king of the first dynasty of Uruk. The King List gives him 126 years. He is the first king in the entire document whose reign falls within the range of a long human life, and he is also the first for whom independent literary evidence exists at massive scale. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved across multiple recensions spanning 1,000 years of cuneiform tradition, most completely on 12 tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, describes a king who seeks immortality after the death of his companion Enkidu, and eventually finds Utnapishtim, the Babylonian flood survivor, the one human granted eternal life as the sole exemption from the mortality the gods imposed on the world after the flood. Utnapishtim lives at the mouth of the rivers, beyond the waters of death. His city before the flood was Shuruppak. He tells Gilgamesh this directly. The last pre-flood city is the flood survivor's permanent address in the literary record, 2,000 years after the events the tradition describes. Now map the decompression fully. The 8 pre-flood kings across 5 cities account for a combined reign of approximately 241,200 years in the Weld-Blundell version. The first post-flood dynasty at Kish accounts for combined reigns already reduced by an order of magnitude across its earliest kings. By the time the list reaches dynasties that overlap with independently verified historical records, the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad, whose dates scholars place around 2334 to 2279 BCE, the reign lengths have reached the range of decades. The transition from pre-flood cosmological time to historical human time is encoded in the mathematics of the document itself. The scribes did not append post-flood history to a mythological preamble. They built a numerical bridge between 2 modes of time, and the bridge is calibrated. Calibration does not emerge from storytelling. It emerges from systems. Consider what calibration requires. Someone had to decide that the pre-flood total would be expressed in multiples of 3,600. Someone had to decide that the decompression would track downward across dynasties rather than resetting arbitrarily. Someone had to maintain that structure across centuries of copying, across political transitions that destroyed every dynasty the list legitimized, across the shift from Sumerian to Akkadian as the dominant administrative language of Mesopotamia. The King List was not simply preserved. It was maintained, actively, deliberately, at every point in the chain, by scribes who understood they were handling something that could not be reconstructed if lost. The Berossus parallel tightens the problem to the point where the coincidence explanation stops functioning. Berossus, drawing on Babylonian temple archives around 278 BCE, archives independent of the Weld-Blundell scribal lineage, as the differences in king names demonstrate, gives a pre-flood king list whose reigns total 432,000 years. That number is exactly 10 times 43,200, the longest single reign in the Sumerian list, the reign of Enmegalana at Bad-tibira, 8 multiples of 5,400. 2 independent transmission lines, separated by centuries, written in different languages for different audiences, encoding the same base unit as the mathematical foundation of the pre-flood world. The Sumerian list distributes 241,200 years across 8 kings. Berossus totals 432,000 years across 10. The totals differ. The unit is shared. That is not 2 cultures independently inventing similar myths. That is 2 cultures independently preserving the same underlying mathematical structure through different scribal lineages. The Genesis genealogies add a third transmission line, again independent, again structurally parallel. 10 antediluvian figures, lifespans beginning near 1,000 years and collapsing across post-flood generations toward the human range. The same decompression, the same rupture point, the same structural assumption that the world before the flood operated by different temporal rules, and that those rules dissolved gradually rather than instantly once the flood had passed. 3 traditions, 3 languages, 3 numerical systems, 1 structure. The pattern stated plainly: a pre-flood world measured in calibrated mathematical units, governed from specific named cities, terminated by a documented catastrophe, followed by a post-flood world that inherited the institutional forms without the temporal scale, and that remembered, across thousands of years of transmission, that something fundamental had changed at the boundary. The scribes who inscribed the Weld-Blundell Prism around 1800 BCE were not inventing that structure. They were preserving it. Every generation that copied the document after them was preserving it. The question they left unanswered, the question the document itself refuses to resolve, is what the structure was originally describing, and whether the 5 cities it names were real, in a way that places them outside everything the official timeline of ancient history currently has room to contain. Think about who copied this document. The scribes who inscribed the Weld-Blundell Prism around 1800 BCE were trained professionals working within a tradition that treated accurate transmission as both a technical obligation and a religious one. They did not compose the King List. They copied it from earlier sources, which had themselves been copied from earlier sources, in a chain extending back at least to the Ur-3 period and possibly further than the surviving tablets allow us to trace. These were not storytellers elaborating a tradition for a new audience. They were administrators preserving a record that someone, at every point in the chain, had decided could not be allowed to disappear. The copying imperative is not a minor detail. It is the most important fact about the document's survival. The Sumerian King List exists in over a dozen distinct cuneiform exemplars from multiple sites, Nippur, Larsa, Kish, Isin, among others, spanning a period from approximately 2000 BCE to at least the late 2nd millennium. It was copied across 500 years of political upheaval, dynastic collapse, and cultural transformation so severe that the language in which it was first composed, Sumerian, ceased to be spoken as a living language somewhere in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Empires rose and were destroyed between the earliest copies and the latest. The religious landscape of Mesopotamia changed substantially, and at every point someone decided the King List was worth copying again. Not because it was useful as a political document. By the time of the Weld-Blundell Prism, none of the dynasties it legitimized were still in power, but because it preserved something that scribal culture, across centuries and across the death of the language it was written in, treated as too important to lose. The scribes understood they were working with material older than their own civilization's legible history. The pre-flood section would have presented them with reign length so far beyond any institutional memory that they could not have verified a single number against any independent source. They copied the numbers anyway. They preserved the city names. They maintained the cosmological formula, kingship descended from heaven, in both the pre-flood and post-flood sections, using identical phrasing for what came before the end of the world and what came after it. They either believed the document was accurate, or they believed it was sacred, or they could not distinguish between those two things. In the scribal culture of ancient Mesopotamia, that distinction may not have been available to them. Shuruppak carries the pre-flood world forward not as a ruin, but as a living reference point. In the flood narrative traditions, it is not simply where the last pre-flood king ruled. It is where the gods issued their warning, where the survivor received his instructions, where the decision to end one world and preserve one human lineage was enacted in a reed hut beside the Euphrates. The city is not destroyed in the narrative, it is the point of departure. Ziusudra leaves it. Utnapishtim, in the Babylonian version, identifies himself to Gilgamesh by it. 2,000 years after the events the tradition claims to describe, the name of the last pre-flood city is still the flood survivor's address. The flood ended his world. It did not erase his location from the memory of everyone who came after him. The archaeological record at Tel Farah, the site identified with ancient Shuruppak, is consistent with this outsized cultural weight in a way worth stating plainly. The site shows occupation from the early 4th millennium BCE. The early dynastic layer, dated to approximately 2600 to 2900 BCE, yielded cuneiform administrative tablets representing some of the earliest writing recovered from any Mesopotamian site, a city that was already generating written records near the beginning of the written record itself. Directly beneath the early dynastic level, the German excavations of 1902 identified a layer of water-deposited sediment approximately 1 metre thick, containing no artefacts, of the kind left by a flood severe enough to interrupt occupation for a substantial period. The dating of this layer corresponds to approximately 2900 BCE, within the archaeological horizon that shows disruption at multiple Mesopotamian sites more or less simultaneously. No archaeologist has claimed this layer proves the literary flood occurred. The evidence does not support that claim, and responsible scholarship does not make it. But the sediment is real, it is datable, it is consistent with a major inundation event, and it sits beneath the one pre-flood city in the King List whose connection to the flood tradition is most explicit, most persistent, and most deeply embedded in every branch of Mesopotamian literature that touched the subject. That is not proof. It is the kind of convergence that keeps a question open when every other consideration would allow it to close. The question the King List leaves open is not whether floods happened in ancient Mesopotamia. They did, repeatedly and destructively, and no serious researcher proposes that flood traditions across the ancient world emerge from pure invention. The question the document leaves open is what the pre-flood section was originally describing. If the 5 cities were mythological constructions assembled by later scribes to provide a cosmic origin for Mesopotamian civilization, then the mathematical structure of the reign lengths is inexplicable. Mythological inflation does not produce calibrated sexagesimal multiples maintained consistently across independent transmission lines in 3 different cultures. If the cities were real administrative centres whose histories the scribes were genuinely attempting to preserve, then the reign lengths represent an encoding of time that does not map onto any historical framework currently available, but that was treated as factual by every generation that considered the document worth copying. The Weld-Blundell Prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The 5 pre-flood cities are under the alluvial sediment of southern Iraq, some excavated to varying depths, none fully understood. The cuneiform archives from Shuruppak are distributed across collections in Berlin, Philadelphia and Istanbul. The flood sediment layer is documented in excavation reports filed in 1902. Everything is accessible. The document has been translated, the mathematics have been analysed, the sites have been dug, and the question the scribes did not answer, perhaps because they no longer knew the answer, perhaps because they understood it so completely that explanation seemed unnecessary, is still sitting in the record they left behind. Was the King List a mythological origin story assembled from theological tradition and astronomical symbolism to give Mesopotamian civilization a cosmic genealogy it had not actually earned? Or was it the last legible copy of an administrative record from a world that ended before writing was supposed to exist? A world whose cities were real, whose rulers governed across spans of time that no current framework can explain, and whose memory the scribes maintained across 5 centuries of copying because they understood, even if they could no longer fully articulate why, that this particular record was not theirs to lose. The tablet is in a museum. The cities are under the ground. The sediment is still there beneath the oldest writing we have found, and the question is still open, the same question, in the same silence that the Weld-Blundell scribes left behind when they set down their stylus and filed the prism away.